A 9-year-old boy holds his feverish little sister in a frozen cave, the only place with clean water for miles. He doesn't scream, doesn't beg. He simply looks into the eyes of the black horse, the silent guide, untamed and unbound. And when the chopper finally arrives, the horse rears and screams, as if waking an entire mountain from slumber. If you think this is just a survival story, you're wrong. Hit subscribe now to catch our next deeply emotional storytelling episodes. The last rays of sunlight slice through the pines like golden knives, carving long, silent shadows over the snow-packed ground. Winter in the mountain town of Sable Creek had come early that year, hard and sharp, like the breath of someone who had long given up on warmth. Chase Granger, 9 years old and always half lost in his own thoughts, raced between the trunks of towering evergreens, his breath puffing out in uneven white clouds. Behind him, a softer set of footsteps crunched in the snow, his sister, Lenny, chasing after him with a mitten dangling from one hand, the other pressed to her mouth as a cough rattled her chest. He paused, turned around, and waited. "Come on, slowpoke," he teased, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. Lenny reached him with a flushed face and glassy eyes. "I'm not slow," she murmured. "I just don't feel good." Chase studied her. Her cheeks were too red. There was something in her eyes that felt distant, like she was only half here. "You're probably just tired," he said, more to himself than her. "Let's head back." The two made their way through the snow-dusted trees toward the house, a small blue-gray structure on the edge of town, sagging under the weight of neglect and silence. The porch light flickered once and died, just like it had every night for the past 6 months. Inside, the heat barely worked. It wheezed like a smoker. The windows rattled whenever the wind howled, which was often. Kyle was in the living room, feet up on the arm of the couch, a half-empty beer bottle resting on his stomach, another in his hand. The glow from the muted television flickered across his face, hollowing his features like a jack-o'-lantern. Olivia stood at the kitchen sink, staring out into the nothing. Her hands moved slowly, mechanically, rinsing dishes they hadn't used in 2 days. When Chase and Lenny stepped inside, the warmth barely touched them. "Take off your boots," Kyle barked without looking. "Don't track snow in." Chase crouched, helping his sister with her laces. She leaned against him, unsteady. Kyle's eyes flicked toward them. "What's wrong with her now?" "She's got a cough," Chase said. Kyle sat up, beer clinking against his belt buckle. "Jesus Christ. You kids go out in 30-degree weather and come back sick. Use your damn heads." "She wanted to come," Chase snapped. Wrong answer. Kyle's boots hit the floor with a heavy thud. He stood, tall and lean, and always angry. "You always have something to say, don't you?" Little man with a mouth too big for his body. Chase didn't flinch. "Not anymore. You think just 'cause I put food in your mouth, you can talk to me like that?" "You didn't put food in my mouth," Chase said, quietly. Kyle moved fast. The room tensed. Olivia dropped a plate into the sink with a sharp clatter, but Kyle didn't hit him. He leaned down until they were eye to eye and said in a voice colder than the air outside, "I'm not your father, and don't you forget that." "I haven't," Chase replied. His hands were trembling. Olivia turned away from the sink. "Kyle, please." He stared at her for a long moment, the beer bottle tight in his hand. Then he exhaled slowly and walked back to the couch. He picked up the remote, unmuted the television, and sat down like nothing had happened. Chase helped Lenny out of her coat. Her skin was warm, too warm. Her lips looked pale. "You need to rest," he whispered. She nodded sleepily and let him lead her to their shared bedroom. He tucked her into the bottom bunk and sat beside her. Outside the window, the wind twisted through the trees, dragging clouds over the moon. "I don't like him," Lenny said, so soft he almost didn't hear it. "I know," Chase said. He sat there until her breathing slowed, becoming shallow and heavy. Then he stood and went to the doorway, where Olivia stood hunched, her arms wrapped around herself like a shield. "Mom? Mom? Mom?" She blinked, startled. Her eyes looked dry and stretched, like paper that had been folded too many times. "Lenny's sick," he said. She nodded. "It's just a cold. She'll be okay." "It's not just a cold. She's burning up. I'll check on her." "Mom?" But she was already walking past him, like a ghost. That night, the storm rolled in with a kind of eerie grace. The sky turned violet. Snow began to fall sideways. The town shrunk under the weight of the clouds. Inside the house, the heat gave up entirely. By midnight, the walls were breathing cold. Lenny woke in a coughing fit. Olivia brought her a wet cloth for her forehead and a spoonful of honey. But she looked afraid not of the illness, but of Kyle. "Can we take her to a doctor?" Chase asked, standing in the doorway of the room. Kyle didn't answer. He was pacing the hallway with a cigarette, muttering something about power lines and outages. When Olivia suggested the cabin, an old hunting place up in the forest where they used to go camping, before Kyle the man scowled but said nothing. By morning, he agreed. They packed hastily. Kyle drove his truck through the snow-covered roads with one hand on the wheel and one hand holding coffee in a styrofoam cup. Olivia sat in silence, staring out the window. Chase sat in the back, holding Lenny close to his chest. Her eyes fluttered open only when she coughed. "I don't feel good," she mumbled. "I know," he whispered. "We're going somewhere better." The forest loomed as they climbed higher into the hills. The road narrowed. Ice slicked the shoulders. Snow blew sideways in fat, desperate flakes. Kyle cursed under his breath as the truck skidded once, then again. The cabin appeared like a memory, half swallowed by trees and snow. The paint had peeled. One window was cracked and boarded. But it stood. Inside, it was musty, dark, and bitter cold. Chase built a fire with logs stacked by the door. Olivia lit a few old lanterns. Kyle poured himself a drink. "It's temporary," Olivia said to no one. Lenny lay bundled on the couch, flushed and trembling. Chase sat beside her, warming a cloth near the fire. Kyle muttered something about brats and babysitting and stepped outside with his bottle. The door slammed. And for a long time, he didn't come back. Chase stood at the window, watching the shadows. The snow had begun to fall harder, like the sky was trying to bury the house. Pine trees bent and creaked under the weight. Kyle's tracks in the snow stretched to the tree line and vanished. Chase waited longer. The night thickened. "Where's Kyle?" Olivia finally asked, wrapping a blanket tighter around her arms. "I don't know," Chase said. He didn't care. Not really. But Lenny's breathing had changed. It came in short, painful gasps. Her forehead was a furnace. They were high up now, too far for phones. No signal, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors. Just snow, trees, cold. Chase looked at his mother. "We need to do something." She looked at the fire. "He'll come back. What if he doesn't?" She didn't answer. "Mom," Chase said, his voice cracking. "What if she dies?" Olivia turned toward him then. Her face was pale, not with fear, but with something deeper. Surrender. "I don't know what to do," she said. The words stung more than a slap. Chase stepped away. He went to the window and pressed his forehead to the cold glass. He thought of all the things he'd wished for. A real father. A warm home. Someone to tell him he was brave. But the silence said it all. He was alone. Except for Lenny. That was enough. He turned back to her. And in that moment, something inside him snapped, not like a break, but like a gear finally locking into place. He pulled on his coat, laced his boots, wrapped a scarf around Lenny's neck. "What are you doing?" Olivia asked. "Getting her out," he said. "You'll get lost. Better than staying here, waiting for someone who's never coming back." Outside, the snow had piled in soft, deceiving waves. He bundled Lenny onto a sled, an old thing from the shed out back. He tied the rope around his chest and pulled, step by step, into the deepening dark. The forest didn't say anything. It just watched, like it always had. The wind slammed against the sides of the cabin like fists pounding on a locked door. The structure groaned in response, bones of timber creaking under the pressure. Snow hissed across the warped windows. From inside, it sounded like whispers, soft, urgent, and impossible to understand. Kyle slammed the door behind him, shaking snow off his boots with a muttered curse. His breath came in clouds. Cold stuck to his beard, clinging to the edges of his collar. "Place hasn't been used in years," he muttered, "freezing in here." Olivia stood near the fireplace, fumbling with a box of matches. Chase watched her from the doorway, arms tight around Lenny, who was already trembling, her forehead pressed against his coat. She wasn't crying, just too tired to shiver. The cabin smelled like mildew and dead wood. The air was thin with old dust and something sour underneath it. A place abandoned not just by people, but by time. Kyle walked past them, went straight to the corner cabinet, and pulled out a flask from his duffel. The silver caught the flickering lantern light just long enough for Chase to see the shake in his hand. "Can't even get decent heat in this goddamn dump," Kyle muttered. Olivia finally struck a match. The flame sputtered, then caught. It licked at the crumpled paper and dry pine cones Chase had collected earlier, and with a rush of heat and smoke, the fire began to grow. Shadows danced along the wooden walls, flickering like ghosts newly awakened. Lenny coughed against Chase's chest. It was deeper now. Not the shallow, dry kind, but the thick, sunken kind that lived in the lungs like a secret. "She needs to lie down," Olivia said, not looking at either of them. Chase carried her to the single cot by the back wall, one side of it broken, sagging inward. He propped up an old pillow and tucked the heavy blanket over her small body. Her eyes fluttered open for a second. "Is it morning?" she asked. "No," Chase whispered. Just rest. Across the room, Kyle cracked open a can of something that looked like beans and took a long swig from the flask. He sat down in the armchair closest to the fire, like he owned the place, like it hadn't been Olivia's father's before him, like the walls didn't hate him back. Silence settled, heavy and bitter. Olivia sat on the floor, back against the fireplace, staring into the flames. Her face looked carved in stone, cold and smooth and unreachable. Outside, the storm howled louder. The cabin rattled once, then again, and then came a sound that didn't belong, low at first, almost like a growl, deep under the foundation, a kind of groaning that built slowly, like the earth clearing its throat. Chase lifted his head. "Did you hear that?" "Wind," Kyle muttered. But the sound came again, this time louder, rumbling up through the floorboards, like something was dragging its fingers along the underside of the cabin. And then, crack, a deep, visceral snap, like bone breaking under pressure. Lenny moaned in her sleep. "What the hell is that?" Kyle stood now, unsteady, eyes darting toward the door. The noise grew louder, rocks shifting, ice breaking, a deep groaning in the mountain itself. Kyle opened the front door. A wall of white slammed into him. Not snow, air. Air pushed so hard, it knocked him back 2 feet before he could shove the door closed. "What was that?" Olivia whispered. Kyle didn't answer. He pressed an ear to the wall, his breath uneven. For a moment, no one moved. Then it came fast, violent, like the earth exhaling all at once. The mountain moved. Chase heard it before he saw it, like 1,000 drums beaten in unison. The windows pulsed with pressure. The lantern fell from the hook and shattered. Glass flew like daggers. Olivia screamed. Chase threw himself over Lenny, covering her with his body as the walls trembled. A roar tore through the forest like a beast. Branches snapped outside. Wood popped like gunfire. The chimney cracked, spilling ash and cinders into the fire. Then, silence. A silence so loud it rang in Chase's ears. The air was thick, heavy with dust. The fire sputtered and died. Olivia coughed from across the room. "Kyle?" No answer. Chase sat up slowly, feeling blood from a cut on his cheek. Lenny still lay beneath him, whimpering softly, soaked in sweat. Olivia stumbled toward the door. It hung crooked on its hinges. Kyle was gone. The snow had stopped falling. Everything had stopped. In the pale blue of early dawn, Chase stepped outside, boots crunching over an unfamiliar terrain. The landscape had changed. Massive rocks now blocked the slope that had once led back to the main road. Trees were split, some lying sideways like felled towers. The truck, Kyle's truck, was half buried beneath debris and ice. "Mom," Chase said, "the road's gone." She stood beside him, barefoot in the snow. Her lips turned blue in seconds. She looked around, then back at the cabin, and said only one word. "Inside." They rebuilt the fire with shaking hands. Chase boiled what little snow he could in a rusted pot. It wasn't much, tasted like dirt. Olivia found old canned goods in a drawer, mostly expired. 1 can of peaches, 2 cans of beans. That was it. The signal on their phones was gone. Nothing but a blinking no service that refused to go away. Olivia tried pacing. Chase tried not to cry. Lenny drifted in and out of fever. She moaned for water, for Mom, for someone to hold her. Chase sat beside her for hours, sponging her forehead with a cloth dipped in the melted snow. The water didn't stay cold long. His hands felt bruised from the chill, fingers red and cracking. "Hey," he whispered, "it's gonna be okay." Her lips moved. No sound came out. He pulled his hoodie off and laid it over her. She was so small. Her bones felt bird-like under the blanket. He stood and walked to the pantry again. Opened it, closed it, opened it again, as if food might magically appear. It didn't. In the dim firelight, he glanced toward Olivia. She sat with her knees to her chest, staring at nothing. He hated her then. For giving up, for being here but not really being here. He pulled on his coat, gloves, hat, tied a scarf around his neck. The fire cast flickering orange light onto the cracked cabin walls, but none of it touched the cold that had crept into his chest. "I'm going out," he said. Olivia didn't respond. He opened the door. A fresh drift of snow had piled against it overnight. He stepped over it and into the soft hush of the forest. The storm had passed, but the mountains still looked broken. Everything looked broken. He wandered behind the cabin, toward the collapsed path, trying to see if there was a way through, but the rocks were too large. Ice sealed everything in place. The truck was done for Hood, crushed beneath a fallen pine. No fuel, no wheels, nothing. He turned, heart pounding. The only sound was the wind moving between the trees like an invisible animal. Back inside, Lenny cried out. Chase bolted through the snow, slammed open the door, and skidded to her side. She was burning up. Her eyes fluttered like wings. Her breath came in short, scared gasps. "Water," she croaked. He rushed to the pot, melted snow, barely warm. She drank a little and coughed most of it back up. "I want to go home," she whispered. He wiped her mouth. "We are home." She shook her head. "Not this one." He didn't answer. Later, after she slept, Chase sat by the fire and stared at the shadows it painted on the wall. One of them looked like a man holding a child, but when he blinked, it was gone. The cold had stopped stinging by now. It had numbed Chase's skin so deeply that he couldn't tell whether the ache in his fingers came from the wind or the desperation sitting heavy in his chest. He walked with his chin tucked low, scarf frozen stiff against his neck, boots cracking through the crusted snow like brittle bones. He had to find water. The melted snow inside the cabin was almost gone, and Lenny was no better. Her face had taken on a waxy sheen. Her eyes barely opened when he called her name. Olivia hadn't moved from her seat near the fire. She was there, physically, but there was nothing behind her eyes anymore. Chase didn't even know if she noticed he'd left. The woods groaned around him, trees heavy with snow, their branches sagging like old backs. The trail that led behind the cabin curved inward through a tight corridor of fir and pine. This was new territory, untouched. He didn't have a destination in mind, only the distant, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, a stream still ran beneath the crust of snow. Somewhere, somehow. Frost crackled beneath his feet. His breath rose like smoke, and then he stopped. 50 feet ahead, half shrouded in the curtain of flurrying snow, something moved. His heart flipped once in his chest. It wasn't a human, and it wasn't running. A shape, large, still, watching. He squinted through the haze. A horse, pitch black, coat gleaming like polished obsidian under the fractured sunlight. It stood alone in the white. No saddle, no rider. Its chest rose and fell, with slow, visible breaths, fogging the air in front of it, a long black mane tangled in the wind. Its eyes, not dull, not distant, were wild, sharp, alert, not angry, but not tamed, either. A single front leg lifted slightly off the snow, as if it were wounded. Chase's body stiffened. His instincts screamed to back away. This wasn't normal. This wasn't safe. But the horse didn't move. It just watched him, and that's when he saw it. Its right foreleg, just above the hoof, was wrapped in a chain, rusted, old, biting into flesh. The chain dragged along the snow in a crooked line, disappearing into the white behind it. Blood dotted the snow where the links had ground against skin. Chase took one slow step backward. The horse's ears flicked once. It didn't retreat. Another step. His breath trembled now. But it didn't charge, didn't rear. It didn't even flinch. It just stood there, waiting. Chase's eyes dropped to the chain again. The way it hung. The tension in the animal's leg. The deep cut it had made into the black fur. Someone had chained it. Someone had kept it, and it had broken free. And now, here it was, in the middle of nowhere, scarred and bleeding but still standing, still breathing, still looking for something. So was he. Something inside Chase shifted. He moved forward. The horse didn't move. Closer. 10 feet. The snow squeaked under each step. The horse's breath hitched, but still it stood. Now Chase could see the details. The jagged iron links rusted orange, flaking into the wind. The flesh around its ankle torn and raw. Its eye rimmed red but unblinking. Chase didn't speak. There was no point. Words were useless here. He crouched, pulled off his right glove with his teeth. His fingers went instantly numb. He reached toward the chain. The horse tensed. A snort of hot breath hit Chase's face like steam, but it didn't move away. He placed one hand gently on its leg. The horse twitched but didn't retreat. His other hand searched for the edge of the chain's loop. Blood had dried into the fur, freezing into a crust that fused iron to flesh. He winced. Pulled. The horse grunted a low, guttural sound but remained still. Chase whispered, more to himself than the animal. I know it hurts." He dug his fingers beneath the cold metal. Flesh tore. His own palm ripped open against the rusted edge, and blood ran down his wrist into the snow. Still, he didn't stop. The metal groaned, shifted. The links cracked like brittle teeth, and then it gave. The chain slipped free. It hit the ground with a heavy, lifeless clank, sinking halfway into the snow. Chase fell backward into the powder, panting. His hand was bleeding. His chest felt like it had cracked open. The horse didn't move. But then it exhaled. A deep, slow breath. A breath that didn't sound like pain. It sounded like release. Wind surged through the trees just then, sharp, sudden, furious. It tore through the woods like a scream. Branches snapped. Snow flew sideways. And in that single instant, the forest shifted. The air changed, like something had been holding its breath, and now it was letting go. The chain at Chase's feet rattled once in the snow and lay still. A looked up. The horse was staring at him different now, less wild, more knowing. It blinked once, then turned slightly, limping back a few steps into the trees. Then it stopped, turned its head, waited. Chase didn't move. The wind howled again, ripping through the branches like laughter. The horse looked at him once more, longer this time, and then turned fully to walk deeper into the forest. But it did so slowly, pausing every few steps, as if inviting him. Chase looked down at his bloody hand, at the chain rusting in the snow. Then he stood. The forest was no longer empty. The white wasn't just cold anymore. It was alive. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone out here. He followed. Not because he trusted the horse. He didn't. But because something about the way it stood, the way it hadn't flinched, hadn't run, hadn't killed him, something about that was familiar. It had looked at him the way people didn't. Not with pity, not with disdain, not like he was a problem someone else would fix, but like he mattered, like he saw it, and it saw him. Blood still dripped from his fingers. He pressed his scarf against the wound. The horse moved slowly now, favoring its right leg, but steady, purposeful, like it knew where it was going. Chase kept his distance. They moved through the snow in silence. Just the wind, the crunch beneath their feet and hooves, the occasional grunt from the horse when the pain spiked. 10 minutes passed, maybe more. The forest thinned. Ahead, beyond a curtain of low-hanging branches, Chase saw at a break in the trees, a clearing ringed with massive boulders. In the center, half covered in snow and rock, was an opening, a cave. The horse stopped at the mouth, turned back. Chase stepped forward, peering into the black. It wasn't deep, not far, but inside he could hear something. Water. A slow drip, the faintest echo of movement. He knelt at the edge and reached in. His fingers touched something cold and wet, not frozen, liquid. A spring. Chase knelt, cupped his hands, and drank. It tasted like stone and earth, and something older than both. He filled the old thermos from his coat pocket, drank again, then stood and looked at the horse. "You saved us," he whispered. The horse said nothing, didn't need to. It turned away again, walked a few paces toward the edge of the trees, then stopped, as if waiting. Chase stood still, wind tearing through his coat. He looked at the cave, the trees, the path they'd taken, and the horse, standing in silhouette against the snow. He didn't understand what this was, didn't know why it had come to him, why it had waited, why it hadn't run, but something told him this wasn't a coincidence. This was something else, and it had only just begun. The horse didn't leave. It stood there, quiet and solid, as the snow settled gently on its back, like the mountain had chosen this one creature to remain unmoved while the rest of the world kept shifting. Chase watched it through a fog of breath and disbelief, expecting it to vanish into the trees at any moment, the way wild things always did. But it didn't. It stayed. He took a step forward. The horse turned its head slightly, not away, not back, just enough to say, "I see you." His fingers, bandaged loosely with the scarf he'd wrapped around the bloody hand, twitched at his side. He hesitated, and then, slowly, he lifted his hand. The horse didn't flinch. Chase stepped closer, snow crunching beneath his boots in uneven rhythm. His breath came faster now, clouds puffing out into the silence like tiny prayers. Then, without a word, without even knowing why, he raised his hand and placed it flat against the horse's forehead. The fur was warm, surprisingly warm, and coarse. Underneath it, he could feel the pulse steady, strong, real. The horse didn't blink. Chase held his palm there for a moment longer, eyes closed. It wasn't affection. It wasn't trust. It was something older than that, like reaching out into a language he didn't speak but somehow understood. Then the horse turned and began to walk. Not fast, not far, just ahead. It didn't look back, didn't need to, because Chase followed. He didn't rush, didn't speak. He turned and began walking back toward the cabin with the calm certainty of someone no longer lost. Behind him, the trees stood silent. When he reached the clearing again, the snow had thickened. Olivia was still inside, curled in the same position, eyes shut, the fire nothing but embers. She didn't move when he entered. Didn't ask where he'd been. Lenny stirred weakly on the cot. Chase knelt beside her, touching her forehead. Still burning, but breathing. He rummaged through the storage again and found the old sled, its metal runners bent, its rope frayed, half buried beneath a pile of canvas and old hunting gear. He dragged it across the floor, the noise startling in the quiet. Olivia looked up, confused, but said nothing. "I'm taking her," Chase said. Olivia stared, empty-eyed. "She won't make it if we stay," he added, tightening the rope. Still, no response. Chase bundled Lenny in every blanket he could find, 3 layers deep. He wrapped her scarf twice around her head and pulled her knit cap down until it nearly covered her eyes. She moaned once, coughed weakly, but didn't open her eyes. He lifted her with effort, her weight limp, her body radiating heat, and laid her gently into the sled. The horse waited just beyond the cabin door, standing still against the wind. Olivia looked toward the open doorway and then back at the fireplace. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Chase didn't wait for permission. He stepped out, one hand holding the sled's rope, the other pressed against his coat to shield his skin from the wind. And so it began, their silent procession. The horse led, Chase followed, and Lenny, wrapped like a fragile thing made of glass and fire, lay behind them, sliding softly across the white like a ghost too stubborn to vanish. There were no words, no plans, only movement. The snow swallowed their footsteps almost as quickly as they were made. The wind hissed like an angry whisper around the trees. Every few minutes, Chase would glance up and see the horse ahead, its black form a sharp contrast against the pale canvas of the world. Its limp had softened, but it never walked fast. It didn't need to. Its ears twitched often, turning toward sounds Chase couldn't hear. It paused occasionally at the edge of a ridge, beside a fallen pine, and waited, not looking back, just waiting, until Chase caught up. Then it would go again. That was their rhythm. Step, slide, breathe. Chase's legs burned, his lungs ached. The sled dragged heavy behind him, catching on roots and dips beneath the snow. Still, he kept going. There was no map, no trail, only the horse. At one point, Chase tripped his knee, slamming into ice beneath the powder. The rope burned against his palm as it slipped loose. He fell hard, face first into the snow. Silence. For a second, he didn't move. Then hooves. He looked up to see the horse standing over him, closer than ever. Eyes staring down like they had seen him fall before he even touched the ground. Chase coughed, pushed himself up. The horse didn't move. He wiped his nose with the back of his glove. His face stung, his knee throbbed. But he got up, gripped the rope, and walked. The horse turned. The journey continued. An hour passed. Maybe two. Time didn't exist here. Only cold and fatigue and the never-ending pull of hope. And yet, it wasn't hopeless. That was the strange part. Despite everything, it didn't feel like desperation anymore. It felt like something sacred, like purpose. There was a moment, brief, unreal, when they reached a clearing between two rock faces. The snow was knee-deep, but the sky opened above them just enough to let the sun break through. Light poured in like liquid gold. It hit the horse's coat and set it glowing, like it wasn't flesh at all, but fire bound into form. Chase stopped, let the rope rest for a moment. He stared. The horse turned, and for the first time it looked directly at him, not past him, not over him, at him. And in that second, Chase felt something break open inside. A wall. A silence he'd carried for years. It didn't shatter with sound, it simply melted. Because for the first time in his life, someone or something was leading him not because they had to, but because they chose to. And he was following not because he was weak, but because he finally believed. Not in the path, not in the outcome, but in himself. He nodded once, and the horse turned again. The clearing passed, the light faded, the snow grew deeper, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with breathing, hooves, footsteps, and something else. Something like music, but quieter, like a song only two souls could hear. The entrance to the cave was narrow, more like a crack in the mountain than a path. If the horse hadn't stopped and nudged its head toward the hidden opening, Chase would have walked right past it. Snow fell in thick sheets now, curling off the ridges like ghosts and choking the trail behind them. The wind howled above, scraping across the rocks in long, mournful moans. But inside that jagged slit in the earth, there was only quiet. The horse didn't follow them in. It remained outside the mouth of the cave, its black shape just visible in the swirling white. Chase hesitated, then ducked under a low-hanging slab of rock, pulling the sled in behind him. The runners scraped against the stone. Lenny didn't stir. Inside, the space opened wider than he expected. A small chamber, barely 6 feet across, but high enough to stand. The walls were rough, streaked with mineral veins. And the floor stone, yes, but dry. Tucked against the far wall was a shallow dip in the ground. From it, a trickle of water ran, moving, not frozen. He staggered over to it, dropped to his knees, and scooped a handful to his lips. It tasted like cold metal and moss, but it was water. Clean, flowing, a spring. He didn't even smile. His face was too tired, but a warmth spread through his chest that wasn't from the drink. He filled the old thermos again, then returned to the sled. Lenny's lips were cracked. Her cheeks glistened with sweat and frost. "Lenny," he whispered, brushing her damp hair from her forehead. "Wake up. I got you water," she moaned. Eyes fluttered open but unfocused. He lifted her gently, propped her against his chest, and tipped the thermos to her lips. At first, she resisted, shaking her head faintly. But then her mouth opened. She drank, slowly. Chase cradled her tighter. "I got you," he murmured. She didn't answer. Her eyes drifted closed again, but her breathing steadied. He wrapped her in the thickest of the blankets and pulled her closer to the back of the cave, away from the entrance. Then he sat beside her. The cave was cold, yes, but it was still. No wind, no sting, just silence and stone. Outside, the storm screamed on. He pulled his coat tighter, laid one hand on Lenny's back to feel her breathing. The other rested on the ground beside him. His fingers brushed something hard inside his backpack. He hesitated, then slowly pulled it out. The chain. The rusted, blood-streaked chain he'd removed from the horse's leg. He didn't know why he'd kept it. It was sharp, filthy. It had torn him open, but it felt like something he needed to carry, something that told the truth. He held it now, curling it slowly in his palm, and suddenly, without warning, he felt it, the memory. It broke into him like a wave. He was 6. It was raining outside. The sound of glass shattering, a voice yelling, a door slammed. And then, arms wrapping around him, a familiar smell, hair in his face, his mother's arms. She held him so tight he couldn't breathe, but he didn't want to. He wanted to stay right there, forever, drenched, trembling, clinging to something warm and human and his. It was the last time she held him. After that, the silence became their language. Her eyes stayed low, her voice vanished. She became a shell of the woman he remembered, and he became something else entirely. A problem, a burden, something to be managed. Tears slid down his cheeks now. He didn't make a sound, just leaned his head back against the cold stone wall, eyes closed, chain still clenched in his hand. The metal dug into his skin. Lenny stirred beside him. He looked down. She was shifting in her sleep, murmuring softly. Sweat beaded on her brow. Then, clearer, "Mama." He froze. Her voice was so small, so frail. "Mama, please." Her eyes opened halfway, looking at nothing. Chase leaned in. "I'm here," he whispered. "It's okay." "Mama," she moaned again. Her body twitched, arms flailing weakly beneath the blankets. Chase wrapped her in his arms. "I'm here," he repeated, firmer now. "Lenny, I'm here. I've got you." She quieted. Her breathing slowed. He held her tight, his cheek pressed to her hair. And in that stillness, that darkness, surrounded by ancient stone and the low hum of water, he felt something shift inside him again. Something click. He wasn't chasing someone else's arms anymore. He wasn't begging for warmth. He was the warmth. He was the arms. He was the one holding. And she was the one who needed holding now. Not because he had to, but because he could. He set the chain down beside him, let it fall to the stone with a dull, lifeless sound. Then he turned, tucked Lenny in deeper, and lay beside her. He didn't sleep, not for hours, but he didn't cry again. Not loud, only the sound of the spring, and his breath, and the horse, just outside, standing like a silent guardian, watching the storm, keeping the wild at bay. The storm had calmed, not by much, but enough to risk flight. High above the tree line, a red and white rescue helicopter cut through the thinning clouds like a silent promise. Inside, 5 figures sat strapped into worn leather seats, each face carved by cold and tension. One of them, Marla, sat nearest the window. Her fingers clutched the edge of the seat, knuckles white through her gloves. Her eyes scanned the ridges below, jagged seams of whitened stone, forests like ink, spills across the pale canvas of the world. Beside her, the pilot muttered something to the man in charge. She didn't listen. She didn't need to. She knew what they were saying. "It's been too long." No confirmed signal. "We did one sweep already. Odds are slim." She'd heard it all before. She'd lived it. The man across from her, Captain Hill, shifted in his seat and leaned toward her. "Marla," he said gently, "you sure you want to burn the last fuel leg on this? We've got 0 heat signatures, nothing but broken terrain and animal tracks." She didn't answer right away. Her gaze never left the window. "Then, I saw the photo." Hill frowned. "What photo?" She reached into the folder on her lap and pulled out the printout. A grainy image, captured from a ranger's drone the day before. Barely discernible, but there it was, a line of hoofprints, across a ridge, alone, straight, unbroken. "Look at the spacing," she said. "That's not a herd, it's not scattered, that's one animal, moving with purpose. And those curves? That's a sled behind it, or something being dragged." Hill scoffed. "You're staking this on a horse?" Marla turned to him. "No," she said. "I'm staking this on a kid." The words hung there, simple, undeniable. Hill looked at the photo again. Then, out the window. He didn't say no. Marla sat back, exhaling for the first time in hours. She reached into her coat and touched the locket around her neck. The silver was tarnished. Inside, a photo creased and water-damaged showed a much younger girl. Freckles, tangled hair, barely smiling. That girl had once stood in the middle of a blizzard, barefoot and crying, with nobody in the world who gave a damn if she lived or died. until one woman, a retired schoolteacher named June, opened the back door of her cabin, wrapped her in a quilt, and whispered, "You're not alone anymore." Marla never forgot that moment, not ever. And now, watching the endless stretch of snow, she felt something tug at her gut. Not pity, not logic, recognition. "I'm coming, kid," she whispered. "Don't you dare give up." Below, the treetops thinned. The helicopter began to descend. The search was on again. By the third morning, Chase had stopped counting hours. Time had blurred into instinct: breathe, move, protect, endure. That was all there was. Lenny was slipping. Her skin was damp, cold, despite the blankets. Her breaths came shallow and slow, each one sounding thinner than the last. She hadn't opened her eyes since the night before. He shook her gently now and then, whispered her name, begged her to drink water, to stay with him. Nothing. Her body was so small under the layers of wool and coats, but it felt impossibly heavy in his arms, like she was already halfway somewhere else. Chase sat with her cradled in his lap, pressing his chest against hers to share the last of his warmth. His own coat was wrapped around her now. He sat there in a sweatshirt too thin for the mountain air, hands trembling, lips pale, eyes locked on her face. Outside the cave, the storm had finally lost its voice. Snow still fell, but softly now, and the wind was more breath than scream. The horse was still there, always there, standing at the mouth of the cave like a statue, a sentinel. Chase had watched it off and on for hours, trying to make sense of its stillness. It didn't lie down, didn't eat, didn't wander. It just waited, guarded, like it knew, like it chose. And then, a sound, a crack in the silence. Not natural, not wind, a rumble low, distant. Chase's head snapped up. The horse lifted its ears, and then it did something Chase hadn't seen it do once in 3 days. It moved. It stepped away from the cave's edge, lifted its head high, and whinnied. Loud, long. The sound echoed off the cliffs and across the ridge like thunder. It wasn't a cry, it was a summon, and after a heartbeat, a reply. Not from another horse. From the sky. The unmistakable, mechanical growl of a rotor slicing through air. A helicopter. Chase bolted upright. He scrambled to the cave's mouth, dragging Lenny behind him in the sled, stumbling over the ice and stone, legs half dead from fatigue. The horse stepped back, making space. He emerged into the light, blinking hard. There above the tree line, through the curtain of falling snow, a red and white helicopter, circling, looking. He waved both arms, shouting until his throat cracked. "Hey, down here, please." The rotors thundered louder. The wind they kicked up blasted the trees, throwing snow into clouds. The horse whinnied again, rearing up on its hind legs and pounding the ground, and the helicopter tilted saw them. A rope dropped. Chase dropped to his knees, clutching Lenny's body close, sobbing from a place deeper than breath. The rope line danced, then tightened. A figure in red and black descended fast, legs swinging wide, arms braced against the wind. She landed in a crouch, steady, practiced, then stood up. Her helmet gleamed. Goggles covered her eyes, but her voice, steady, warm, cut through everything. "I've got you." Chase couldn't answer. He could barely breathe. The rescuer, Marla, stepped forward and knelt beside him. She checked Lenny first, pulled off one glove, pressed fingers to the girl's neck, looked at her lips, her breath. Then she turned to Chase. "Is this your sister?" He nodded. "She's strong," Marla said. "She's still fighting, but we need to move." She looked back up at the hovering bird and tapped her comms. 1 miner, unconscious. Male, 9 conscious, responsive. Sending them up. Another figure came down. A medic. As the medic began strapping Lenny into the harness, Marla turned to Chase. He stared at her, eyes wide, silent, fists clenched. He didn't know what to say, didn't trust it, didn't believe it. She didn't push. She only reached out slowly and opened her arms. That's all. No words, no demand, just a space. And Chase, he moved. Without a thought, without permission, without fear. He stepped into her arms and collapsed. Not from pain, not from exhaustion, from release. He buried his face into her shoulder and sobbed. Ugly, loud, gut-wrenching. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he was being held, not restrained, not ignored, not tolerated. Held. Marla whispered nothing. Just let him. Her arms tightened. She rocked him once. And for Chase, that was enough. That was everything. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and lemons. The walls were too white, too clean, like they were trying to scrub out anything human. Chase sat in the corner. Lenny slept in the bed, an IV in her arm and a warm light on her face. She looked peaceful now, warm, real. Chase hadn't let go of her hand since the nurse brought them in. He hadn't said a word to anyone. Not the doctor, not the social worker, not even Marla. Until now, the door creaked open. Boots, then breath. Kyle. He stood in the doorway like he'd been summoned from another life. Unshaven, hair wild, shirt wrinkled. A man playing the role of someone grieving. "Chase," he said, voice rough. "Thank God you're okay." I didn't know. I came as soon as I heard." He took a step in. Chase didn't move. Kyle kept going. "I was wrong, all right? About the cabin. I panicked when I saw the road was blocked. I went for help, I swear. I told people. I thought someone would find you two." Another step closer. Chase looked up. His eyes were clear, empty of fear. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Kyle continued, kneeling now. "I was scared. But you're here. That's all that matters. Let's go home, okay?" That word, home. It tasted like rust and lies. Chase reached into his backpack, pulled something out. A small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He unwrapped it slowly, laid it on the table beside the bed. The chain, rust still stained its links. The blood was gone, but the weight remained. Kyle stared at it. "What's this supposed to be?" Chase finally spoke. "Yours." Kyle's face twitched. "What's that supposed to mean?" No answer. Only Chase's eyes, unblinking, steady. Kyle stood, anger replacing guilt. "You think you're smart now? You think you're a man because you dragged your sister through the snow like some hero? You have no idea what it takes to survive in the real world." He leaned in. Chase didn't flinch. "She's my daughter. And you," he jabbed a finger. "You're nothing but a stray some woman let into her house." The door opened. Marla, she'd heard every word. "I think we're done here," she said, calm. Kyle turned. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who actually showed up," she said. "That's who." He scoffed. "You got no right." "I have every right," she snapped. "I filed the paperwork this morning." Kyle blinked. "What?" She held up the manila envelope. "Emergency petition for guardianship, based on abandonment, negligence, and willful endangerment of minors." Kyle laughed. "You think the state's gonna hand them over to you?" Marla took a breath, looked over at Chase, then back to Kyle. "I don't think," she said. "I know." She stepped between him and the bed. "This boy walked through a blizzard with a half-dead sister, a broken sled, and a bleeding hand, guided by a feral horse and pure willpower. And you, what did you do? You left. You drank. You lied." Kyle didn't answer, just glared. Marla stepped closer, lowered her voice. "Walk away, before I press charges and make sure you never step near them again." He didn't blink, didn't move. Then, he did. Out the door. Gone. Marla turned. Her eyes were red now. She didn't try to hide it. She sat down beside Chase, slow. For a long time, they said nothing. The chain sat between them. Finally, she asked, "Do you want to talk?" Chase shook his head. She nodded, then whispered, "Okay." The next morning, she signed every line, every box, every form. Social services watched, nodded, didn't smile, didn't question. Too many files, too few hands. The system didn't care unless a kid died. But this time, someone had cared, and someone had survived. Chase stood beside her when she signed. He watched the pen move, watched the pages flip. Lenny sat in a wheelchair beside him, a stuffed bear in her lap. The nurse had given it to her. She named it Midnight. No one knew why. But Chase did. When the last paper was signed, Marla turned to them. She didn't kneel, didn't bend, just stood there, arms loose, heart open. "You don't have to come with me," she said. "I'll keep you safe if you do. But it's your choice." Chase looked at Lenny, then back at Marla. "I choose you," she smiled. And for the first time, so did he. The forge was still hot when they arrived. An old shack pressed into the base of a mountain, its chimney coughing black smoke into the gray Utah sky. Inside, iron tools hung like ghosts on the wall. Hammers, clamps, anvils, everything heavy. Everything made to hold or break. Jenkins stood at the center of it all, like the last tree after a fire. His hair was wild and gray, his beard like steel wool soaked in whiskey and wind. One of his eyes was clouded, the other sharp. He was polishing a bridle when the bell above the door creaked. He didn't turn. "Unless you brought me something that bites," he muttered. "I ain't in the mood for small talk." Marla stepped in first. Then Chase. Then the horse. The black one. Midnight. It paused in the doorway, breath steaming, eyes burning with something older than fear. Jenkins looked up and stared. Long. Slow. Then, "Well, I'll be damned." Chase took a breath. "You know him?" Jenkins didn't smile, but his hands stilled. "I knew him," he said. "Long time ago, before he vanished into them hills." He set the bridle down and limped closer. "He was smaller then, feral as sin. We caught him once, roped him by the neck, dragged him down that ridge like he was some cursed thing that needed breaking." His voice was dry, cracked with memory. "We tried everything. Food, whips, water torture. Nothing stuck. He kicked 3 men, tore down a steel gate, and leapt a damn ravine to get free." Chase stared. You tried to hurt him? Jenkins posed. I was younger, meaner, and stupid. The words hung there like smoke. But, he added, pointing a crooked finger at the horse, he remembered. That's the thing about the ones who survive. They don't forget. Chase stepped closer to the fire pit, pulled something from his pocket, the chain, still rusted, still his blood on it. He laid it on the anvil like an offering. I want to make something from it, he said. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. Like what? Chase looked at the horse, then back at the fire. A symbol. Not to bind, but to carry. Like memory. Jenkins didn't ask more. He just nodded once and pulled on his apron. Then we do it the old way. The forge roared to life. Bellows hissed. Flames danced. Metal turned red, then white. Chase stood beside Jenkins, sleeves rolled, watching every move. The old man showed him how to hold the tongs, how to strike not too hard, not too soft. Not every blow is about breaking, Jenkins said. Some are just about reshaping. Sweat ran down Chase's face, but he didn't blink. He hit the chain until it glowed. They straightened it, bent it, twisted it, linked it into a loop. They etched it not with letters, but with symbols. A feather, a hand, a flame, a hoof. Finally, they quenched it in water. The hiss was loud, final, cleansing. Jenkins lifted it from the basin with tongs and laid it on a cloth. What now? Chase asked. Jenkins walked to the horse. It hadn't moved the whole time, like it was watching a ritual. The old man reached out slowly, wary. The horse didn't flinch. He lifted the chain and draped it gently around the beast's neck. It hung loose. It didn't bind. It rested, shimmered in the firelight. Looks better on him than on any man I've ever met, Jenkins said. Then his voice dropped. He ain't a wild horse, kid. That's what people call what they can't understand, what they can't tame. But this one, he's something else. Chase tilted his head. Jenkins stared into the horse's eyes. He's a witness. To what? Jenkins exhaled. To every child that ever got left behind. Silence. Then, Marla, from the doorway. You believe that? Jenkins turned to her. I know that. And Chase, he did too. Because somewhere deep in the black horse's gaze was him. The snow was falling again, thin and soft, like the sky had finally exhaled. Chase stood on the ridge where it had all begun. The same frozen clearing where he first saw the black horse, half-shadowed in mist, iron chain digging into its leg. The place where he'd bled for something wild, something misunderstood, something kindred. Now, days later, they stood again in that place, but everything had changed. The storm had passed. The world was quiet. The horse stood beside him, still wearing the forged chain-turned necklace. It caught the moonlight now and then, like a heartbeat flickering against its chest. Chase held the reins loosely in his hand, but he didn't need them. He never had. Okay, he whispered, his breath white and thin. You're free now. The words caught in his throat. He stepped back, slow, careful. 2 steps, then 3. The horse didn't move. It stood still, eyes fixed on something invisible beyond the trees. You don't owe me anything, Chase said. You helped us. You saved her. You don't have to stay. He took another step back. His boots crunched in the snow. Still, the horse did nothing. Chase felt the first tear break. He didn't wipe it. I know you belong out there, he whispered. I don't want to keep you from it. He let the reins slip from his hand. They fell like a ribbon between them. He turned to go. 1 step. 2. Then he heard it. Crunch. A hoof. The horse had taken a step forward. Chase turned. Its ears twitched. Its head dipped once slow. Deliberate. Chase frowned, confused. He pointed toward the woods. Go on, he said, voice cracking. That's where you belong. But the horse didn't budge, didn't blink, only watched. Chase's shoulders collapsed. His knees hit the snow. He cried. Not the desperate, hollow sobs of the cave. These were different. He wasn't broken anymore, just open. He felt arms around him, not hooves, arms. Marla knelt beside him, pulling him gently into her coat. I followed you, she whispered. Didn't want you saying goodbye alone. Chase leaned into her, shaking, crying. I wanted to set him free, he said, but he won't go. Marla looked at the horse. It hadn't moved. She smiled through her own tears. Maybe he already is free, she said. Maybe he doesn't want to leave anymore. Chase wiped his face with his sleeve. He's supposed to be wild. Marla placed her hand on his back. Wild things don't always want to run, she said. Sometimes. They stay when they feel safe. They both looked at the horse again. Still, calm, present. A silent guardian in a world that had offered no protection until now. Chase reached for the reins again. This time, not to lead, but to walk beside. Together, the 3 of them started down the trail. No words, just footsteps, and breath, and snow. A full year passed. Winter returned to the mountains, gentler this time. The wind no longer howled like a warning. It whispered, like an old song finally remembered. In the heart of town, right where the old water trough used to sit, stood a new wooden post carved from cedar and darkened by fire. It was tall, sturdy, handmade. At its crown, a hand-carved plaque shimmered with the morning frost, the guardian of the ridge, dedicated to the forgotten souls who once wandered, lost and silent, until something wild walked beside them. People stopped to read it. Some wept, some stood still, just breathing. The children loved it most. Every winter since the storm, the town now held a festival Ridge Day to honor the ones who had survived, and the one who had never spoken, never fled, never asked to be loved, but stayed. Snow dusted the rooftops as families gathered near the town square, bundled in scarves and wool mittens. Laughter echoed through the streets. Chase stood at the edge of the stage, no longer the silent boy hiding behind hospital walls. His voice had grown stronger, not louder, just rooted. Marla stood near the back, a mug of cider in her hands, and Lenny curled beside her in a red parka, drawing with a crayon on the back of a paper plate. Behind the stage, tethered loosely, stood a black horse, older now, scar across his flank, eyes like winter storms, and around his neck, the same forged chain, worn now, but still shimmering in the cold sun. Chase stepped to the microphone, took a breath. He looked out at the crowd, then up toward the distant ridge where wind swept over white stone. And he began. I used to think freedom meant running away. His voice was calm, steady. I thought being free meant no one could ever hurt you again, or tell you weren't enough, that it meant cutting every rope, burning every bridge, vanishing. The crowd was silent. Even the wind paused. But that's not freedom, not the kind that lasts. He held up a photograph of him and Lenny, taken last spring. In it, she held a crayon sketch of a horse with wings. He was laughing, really laughing. Freedom, Chase said, is when someone looks at you just as you are and says, you're not too broken to love. A murmur rippled through the people. Eyes welled. Freedom is when someone removes the chain, not because you escaped, but because they believe you deserve to be unchained. He turned, looked at the black horse, smiled, and sometimes you stay, not because you have to, but because you finally want to. He stepped back, silence, then the first clap, then a second, then the whole square rose with applause that cracked open the sky. Later that afternoon, Chase stood at the top of the ridge again, same place, same snow. He didn't wear gloves, didn't need them. The horse Hope stood beside him, reins draped across his shoulder, not held. Chase reached out, touched the animal's neck. You can go, he said, any time. You know that, right? Hope huffed, breath visible like fog. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just looked east toward the endless woods, the cliffs, the cold stars, where he might have once roamed freely. The chain around his neck stirred. The breeze picked up light at first, then stronger. It lifted the links like they were feathers, and they danced, spinning in the air, catching the late golden light, not shackled, not broken, transformed. Chase didn't cry this time. He just watched and listened. The wind was no longer something to fear. Now, it carried stories, legends, and somewhere in its folds, you could hear a hoofbeat, one single rhythmic sound that said, I was here.